Today we're going to touch on the second category of potential security threats: open source software and application risk. You've probably heard of some of the recent large-scale open source issues. The Struts 2 vulnerability a few years ago, Log4j more recently. In both cases, an attacker could launch an exploit quickly, gaining access to vulnerable systems. These were critical vulnerabilities in very popular libraries, so they drew a lot of attention. But it's important to realize that vulnerabilities happen frequently in all sorts of open source components. You need to manage this risk. And it's easy to understand why open source components pose a security threat. In most applications today, over 80% of the application is open source code. There's a reason that percentage is so high. Building upon existing open source code is key to innovation. You can focus on the key value you're creating and use open source for common functionality. It saves a ton of developers' valuable time. And I'm not saying open source is bad, just the opposite. It's great. But by using these components, you also take responsibility for keeping them secure. If any one of these is vulnerable, it can make your entire application vulnerable. And for every one of these components, there's a supply chain that you need to monitor to know if the version you're using has a vulnerability. This process of monitoring dependencies is called software composition analysis, or SCA. SCA tools work by scanning your application or containers and making an inventory of every component. For each component, it also records the version. Then for every one of these component versions, the SCA tool compares the version you're using against the tool's own threat intelligence database to check if there are any known vulnerabilities. More advanced SCA tools also scan source code and integrate into your build pipeline to ensure that no known vulnerability is ever introduced to your deployment. Any vulnerabilities that violate your threshold can be rejected as part of the code review process. At Trend Micro, our Cloud One platform can detect vulnerable components across instances, containers, Lambda functions, and directly in your source code repositories, providing full visibility of your risk. And if a potential threat does arise, it's addressed and resolved before it impacts your business. To learn more about how Trend Micro and AWS offer end-to-end security and support, look for Trend Micro Cloud One on AWS Marketplace and sign up for a free trial.